The wind was the first thing anyone remembered about that morning. Not the cold, not the cliffs, not the emptiness of that car park. It was the wind, sharp, restless, carving its way across the south coast long before the sun found the horizon. The kind of wind that makes everyone feel unsettled, even before you know why. In Albany, people were waking to their Sunday routines, kettles boiling, heaters humming, children climbing out of warm beds. Nothing felt out of place, nothing felt unusual. But out near Torndirrup National Park, where the road narrows and the ocean swallows sound, something was already wrong. A car sat parked near the lookout, keys still inside, engine cold, no sign of its owner. And within the hour, a call would come into Albany Police, a call that would anchor itself in the town's memory for decades. Long before the headlines, long before the inquest, long before anyone understood the weight of what happened, the story began out there, on the edge of the continent, on the edge of truth, where the wind carried everything except answers. This is episode 5 of Vanished West, The Silence at the Gap. In the hours before Peta Weber disappeared, nothing in her life suggested she was about to walk into danger on a remote cliff line. She spent Saturday the 21st of June 1997 moving through Albany the way any young mother would, quietly, routinely, without drawing attention to herself. Late that afternoon she visited a friend. That friend would later recall Peta's mood as flat, tired, but steady, not distressed, not volatile, simply worn down in the way she often was in the months leading up to her disappearance. She spoke about ordinary things, the children, money, the grind of trying to keep her life together. It was the kind of conversation people forget if nothing happens afterwards. Except something did. And that small, unremarkable visit became the last confirmed sighting of Peta alive by anyone other than her husband. As daylight faded, the Weber house settled into its Saturday rhythm. 2 children, John 7 and Abigail 2, were bundled into the car and taken to Richard's mother's home for the night. According to Richard, he and Peta were planning to go night fishing at the Gap. It was winter, the wind was severe, and the cliffs were notorious for their danger. It was not a place families typically went after dark. The coronial findings note that Richard made this plan clear. They were going to fish together on a coastline known for unpredictable swells and black uneven rock. But no one saw them leave. No one saw them arrive. And no one saw Peta at any point that evening. What is known is that after the children were dropped off, Peta was never seen again by any independent witness. The official record of the night, every detail, every moment, every shift, comes directly from Richard. And in the years that followed, investigators would scrutinize those details closely. They found no evidence, not a single piece, that Peta was alive past the late afternoon of that Saturday. But on that evening, to the outside world, nothing seemed unusual. A young couple, troubled but trying again, 2 children staying with their grandmother, a Saturday night in Albany, quiet and uneventful. If Peta sensed danger, she didn't show it. If she feared something, she kept it to herself. And if she had any idea that this would be her final night, she did not say a word to anyone. In the hours that followed, the only account we have is Richard's. A version of events the coroner would later describe as inconsistent with the evidence, unsupported by the scene, and impossible to accept as true. But as Saturday slipped into Sunday, one thing became absolutely clear. Whatever happened to Peta between the moment she left her friend's house and the moment her husband flagged down a passing car near the Gap the next morning did not happen by chance. Long before her name appeared in the headlines or coronial files, Peta Simone Hinge was a girl growing up in a family marked by instability. The inquest records note that her early years were shaped by conflict between her parents, financial pressure, and periods where she lived with relatives instead of under one roof. Nothing came easily. She learned young how to move quietly through tension, how to adapt, how to keep peace where peace didn't naturally exist. When she was 17, she married her first husband, Andrew. They were too young and too fragile for the life they were stepping into. Within months, the marriage fractured under the weight of fear and violence. Peta later told people he was controlling, unpredictable, and physically abusive. Their son John was born into that storm when she was barely 18. By the time he was 6 months old, the marriage was over. She left with her baby, her bruises, and very little else. Those who knew Peter in the years that followed said she carried that experience quietly but heavily. She was gentle, hopeful, and determined to build a stable life with John, but also vulnerable, worn down, and still believing that love meant learning how to endure. It was during this period that she met Richard Webber. He was older than she was, confident, socially capable, someone who appeared steady and reliable. The kind of man who, from the outside, seemed to offer the stability she had always wanted but had been denied. Peter fell quickly. She wanted partnership, security, a family. She wanted someone who would care for her without the violence and volatility she had escaped. They married in 1993. 2 years later, they welcomed their daughter, Abigail. For a time, Peter appeared settled. She had 2 children, a home in Albany, and a partner she hoped she could trust. But as the coronial evidence later revealed, the stability she longed for was not what she found inside that marriage. The inquest heard testimony from family and friends describing a pattern of behaviour in the Webber household that is now recognised as coercive control. Richard was jealous, suspicious, and increasingly controlling. He monitored her movements. He became angry when she spent time away from him. He created rules around money, around who she could see, around how the home worked. Peter, who already experienced a violent relationship once, found herself trying to manage another, one that left fewer bruises but left its mark nonetheless. Her cousin Simone told the inquest that Peter sometimes came to stay with her when things became too overwhelming. She would arrive at Simone's door, tense, quiet, and exhausted. She would talk about arguments, about feeling trapped, about not being sure how to get on without losing control of her life again. Simone recalled seeing bruises. She recalled Peter crying. She recalled that Peter confided she was frightened of Richard's temper. The coroner accepted this evidence. It formed part of the pattern that would later become impossible to ignore. As the marriage deteriorated, Peter attempted to leave. Not once, but more than once. In 1996, she moved to Perth with John, leaving Richard behind. Her daughter Abigail remained in Albany with him after a fraught custody compromise that left Peter feeling cornered. She didn't want to leave Abigail, but she also couldn't keep living the way she was. The separation that year was one of survival, but it came at a cost that kept pulling her back. The inquest records show that Peter was torn during this period. She loved her children fiercely. She feared losing them. She wanted to parent both of them in the same home, and Richard understood exactly how to use that fear. Throughout 1996 and into early 1997, Peter and Richard were locked in custody disputes, negotiations, and attempts at reconciliation. He told her she could leave if she wanted, but that Abigail would stay with him. Those close to her said the message was always the same. You can go, but you don't take her. And Peter, who'd already struggled to raise John alone, felt like she'd run out of safe options. She returned to Albany, reluctantly. She moved back into the Webber home, not because the relationship had healed, but because she believed it was the only way to keep both children in her life. People who saw her during this period said she looked tired, defeated, and anxious. A woman trying to hold herself together under constant strain. The coronial findings detail how, once she returned, the atmosphere in the house did not improve. Richard began charging her rent and food money, forcing her to pay to stay in the home she shared with her husband. They were no longer sharing a bedroom. They were functioning as a couple in name only. And yet Peter stayed, not because she felt safe, not because she felt loved, but because she felt trapped. By money, by custody, by fear, by hope, and by the belief that she could endure just a little longer until she found the strength or the opportunity to leave again. By June 1997, Peter was talking to friends about leaving once more. She didn't speak in dramatic declarations. She spoke in the frustrated, weary tones of someone who is quietly planning an escape. She told people she was no longer in love with Richard. She told them she didn't want this life anymore. She was trying to find the courage to go. And as domestic violence experts now know, and the coronial reports reflect, the most dangerous moment in any coercively controlling relationship is when a woman decides to leave. That is the point where some men escalate, where control becomes threatened, where fear turns into action. By early 1997, the air inside the Weber household had changed. What had once been tense was now suffocating. Everyone who saw Peter during this period described the same thing: a woman shrinking inside her own life. The coronial findings outlined several accounts from friends and family that paint a consistent picture. Richard had become more controlling, more volatile, more unpredictable. His moods moved quickly. His anger came without warning. His behaviour, by modern standards, matched the markers of coercive control, a pattern that often escalates before a woman attempts to leave. Even Abigail, only as a toddler at the time, was not spared the tension. John, older and more aware, was sometimes the target. The inquest accepted evidence that Richard's treatment of John could be aggressive and punitive. For Peta, this raised the stakes even higher. Leaving didn't just affect her, it meant she could be losing a child, failing to protect the other, or risking Richard's anger in a way she couldn't manage. People close to her began noticing small worrying things. She spoke carefully, she moved carefully, she seemed nervous if she thought Richard might overhear her. She smiled less, and she slept less. These weren't isolated anecdotes, they were a pattern, the kind of pattern you only see clearly in hindsight, when every red flag lines up and forms a single terrible picture. The inquest also accepted evidence that Peter had been locked in rooms during arguments, that she'd been shouted at, that she'd been controlled financially, that Richard had taken steps to limit her independence. It was subtle enough that outsiders didn't always recognise it, but overt enough that Peter felt trapped. Custody battles made everything worse. She loved both of her children. She feared losing either one, and Richard knew that. Whenever she tried to leave, Abigail became the anchor he held onto. If you go, she stays. If you leave her. But it was not said outright in those exact words, but it was the message everyone understood. By the time Peter returned to Albany, she and Richard were living as housemates more than spouses. They slept in separate rooms, they operated as separate people in the same house. Richard charged her rent and food money, a financial pressure that kept her dependent. This detail, confirmed in the coronial findings, is a hallmark of coercive domestic abuse. It gives the abuser power. It makes leaving harder. Peter told her cousin Simone that she didn't love Richard anymore. She wanted out. She wanted to take Abigail with her. She wanted to rebuild her life again. But she was exhausted, emotionally, physically, financially. She needed a plan. She needed a safe moment. In the weeks before she vanished, she talked about leaving again. Friends recalled she hoped to move north, perhaps back to Perth, perhaps somewhere she could start fresh. She was weighing options. She was trying to find courage. She was doing that quiet calculation so many women in dangerous relationships do. When can I leave without making things worse? When can I leave without losing my children? When can I leave safely? On one visit to Simone, Peter broke down crying. She told her she was scared. She told her she felt controlled. She told her she didn't know what to do. This wasn't impulsive panic. It was a deep, low hum of fear that had been vibrating inside of her for months. Those closest to her saw she was fading, not disappearing physically, but dimming inside of herself. Her confidence eroded. Her voice softened. Her decisions became cautious, calculated to avoid conflict. By mid-June 1997, their relationship was no longer functioning. Peter was effectively living as a single mother inside her own home. Richard's behaviour had escalated to the point where even small disagreements carried tension. The control he exerted was tightening, and Peter was preparing, quietly, to try to leave again. This was the environment she was living in when the final weekend arrived. Not a home, not a marriage, but a pressure chamber. And on that night of Saturday, the 21st of June, 1997, that pressure would reach its breaking point. Before the cliffs, before the missing persons report, before the anonymous call, before the decades of silence, there was a woman trying to survive long enough to find her way out. Saturday, the 21st of June, 1997, began like any other winter weekend in Albany. Cool air, early darkness, and a heaviness that seemed to sit over the Weber home long before the sun dipped down behind the hills. By late afternoon, Peter had visited a friend. That friend told the inquest that Peter seemed quiet, tired, and weighed down, but not fearful, not panicked, and not behaving in a way that suggested she was contemplating a dangerous outing on the coast. She stayed for a while, talked softly, then left as evening approached. After this moment, no one except Richard ever saw Peter alive again. At some point early that evening, the Webber children, 7-year-old John and 2-year-old Abigail, were dropped at Richard's mother's home for the night. The stated plan, according to Richard, was that he and Peter were going night fishing at the Gap. Night fishing in June, in harsh coastal wind, on one of WA's most unforgiving cliff lines. The coronial findings highlight the strangeness of this plan. It was cold, conditions were rough, it was not a typical recreational decision. And importantly, no one saw Peter leave the house to go fishing. No neighbours, no family, no passing witnesses. Nothing anchors her movements that night except Richard's word. Richard later claimed that after dropping off the children, he and Peter drove to a service station to buy bait. Then he said they travelled on towards the national park. But the inquest noted significant detail. There is no independent evidence whatsoever that the trip to the Gap occurred with Peter in the car. No CCTV, no attendant recalling seeing her, no sighting of her with Richard, no physical evidence, nothing except Richard's account. According to him, they arrived at the Gap after dark and set themselves up to fish. The area at night is dangerous. Uneven rocks, crashing waves, sudden gusts of wind, yet Richard claimed they spent hours there without issue. He said they slept in the car. He said they fished intermittently. He said they were together the entire time. Except the evidence would later show that none of this could be confirmed. Not a single person saw them. Not a single item belonging to Peter was found. No gear was found arranged in a way that matched his story. No environmental disturbance suggested two people moving around that site during those hours. By morning, according to Richard, they were still at the cliffs. He said Peter woke early and told him she needed the toilet. He said she walked away towards the long drop facility positioned uphill from the rocks. He said she never returned. At 7:32 a.m, he found reception thanks to the couple who stopped their car and made the call to police. He told officers his wife had vanished, disappeared, walked away and never came back. But when police arrived, the scene contradicted him immediately. The ground leading to the toilet block was undisturbed. There were no footprints consistent with Peter's movement. The coastal scrub was untouched. The sand and soil had no sign of recent passage. The toilets showed no trace of her, and the path Richard claimed she used did not match the terrain in a way that made sense. The coroner was unequivocal. There was no evidence, not even a trace, that Peter had walked anywhere that morning. Richard's version of events simply did not align with the physical reality of the site. Within the first hour of the search, doubt had already formed. And then came the turning point. While officers were still combing the cliffs, an anonymous caller contacted police, stating that Richard had pushed Peter from the Gap. The coronial report confirms that this call was received shortly after Peter was reported missing, and that it was taken seriously from the outset. Police launched a full-scale search, land and sea, search dogs, SES, marine rescue, aircraft scanning the water beneath the formation known as the armchair. Nothing. No clothing, no belongings, no body, no evidence of a fall, no indication that Peter had ever been near that edge. Her car remained in the car park, with the keys inside. The children remained at Richard's mother's, and Peter remained missing. For investigators, the silence of the scene said more than Richard ever did. And back in Albany, family and friends began waking to their Sunday mornings, unaware that Peter had already been reported missing, unaware that the cliffs were being scoured, unaware that their daughter, their sister, their friend, their mother was gone. When the first officers stepped outside of their vehicle that Sunday morning at the Gap, the wind was so loud it swallowed conversation. The cliffs were slick from overnight moisture. The ocean below violent and endless. It was the kind of place where a fall would be deadly, but also the kind of place where a fall leaves signs. There were no signs. The first thing police noted was the ground. The soil, sand and scrub between the rocks and the toilet block told its own story, and it wasn't the one Richard had given. The coronial findings emphasise that there were no footprints, no scuff marks, no flattened grass, no indicators at all that someone had walked the route Richard claimed Peter had taken moments before she disappeared. It was undisturbed, pristine even, untouched by anything except the wind and the night. The path to the toilets wasn't just empty. It looked like no one had walked it recently, let alone a woman in sandals early on a cold morning, heading uphill towards a block that was difficult to reach without leaving a trace. The toilets themselves showed no sign of Peter, no belongings, no evidence she'd entered, no suggestion she'd ever been in there. Within minutes of arrival, police quietly recognised what the coronial findings later made explicit. Nothing at the scene supported Richard's account of a woman walking to the toilets and vanishing. The officers began searching anyway. They followed their training. Assume nothing, search everything. They moved along the cliff's edge, scanning each jut of a rock, each crevice where a fall could be fatal. They looked down into the foam and the dark sea beneath the formation known as the armchair, where the swell slammed against the rock so violently it sent up white spray. There was nothing. Not a single piece of clothing, not a shoe, not a strap of fabric, not a body. If someone had fallen into that water, something should have surfaced or washed in. Nothing ever did. Then came the anonymous call. The coronial findings confirmed that during the early stages of the search, an unidentified male caller rang police and stated that Richard had pushed Peter from the cliffs. He refused to give his name. The line disconnected. Investigators could never trace him. The timing mattered, the specificity mattered, and although the call alone wasn't proof, it deepened the suspicion already forming on the ground. Officers expanded the search immediately. Marine rescue deployed vessels. Helicopters scanned the shoreline. SES volunteers combed the surrounding terrain. Police dogs were brought in. Divers entered the freezing water where conditions allowed. They searched for hours. They found nothing. The coronial report notes that this was highly significant. Falls at the gap are rarely silent and seldom leave no trace. If Peter had fallen accidentally, investigators expected they would recover her or at least find debris, but the coast kept quiet. Meanwhile, Richard remained at the scene, repeating the same version of events. She went to the toilet, she didn't come back. His effect was noted by some as unusual, emotional but inconsistent. Not frantic, not panicked, more controlled. In the following hours, as search crews spread out along the coast, police began speaking to Peter's family. They asked the same questions investigators always begin with. Had she left before? Would she walk away? Would she disappear deliberately? Would she harm herself? Every answer was the same. No, never, absolutely not. They described Peter as a devoted mother, someone who fought to stay in her children's lives, even in the hardest of circumstances. Someone who would never abandon them, not for a night, not for a day. She didn't walk out. She didn't go missing. She didn't leave her children in limbo. The coronial report makes this clear. There was no suggestion Peter was suicidal, no history of wandering, no behavioural indication she would leave voluntarily, which meant the possibilities narrowed quickly. She had fallen, she had walked away and gotten lost, or something had happened to her before dawn. The first two were ruled out by the scene. The last remained. By the end of the day, investigators faced a troubling truth. They had a missing woman, a dangerous cliff line, a husband with the only narrative, no physical evidence to support that narrative, and an anonymous voice alleging murder. This early suspicion would never fade. It would only solidify. Through interviews, through statements, through the unfolding years and the inquest that would come decades later. The sea had given up nothing. The cliffs had revealed nothing. And the silence at the gap became the loudest sign of all. As the search continued along the cliffs, detectives began the second critical strand of any suspicious disappearance, understanding the last person to see the missing woman alive. In Peter's case, that person was Richard, and from the first conversation, things did not add up. His story was simple, too simple. They'd gone night fishing, they slept in the car, they woke early, Peter went to the toilet, she didn't come back. But when police pressed him for details, the gaps widened. The timeline just didn't hold. Richard struggled to account clearly for the hours between leaving the house and arriving at the gap. His estimated time shifted. His descriptions of when they fished, when they slept, and when Peter left the car contradicted early statements. The location didn't make sense. Night fishing at the gap was not something people in Albany typically did, especially not on a wet, windy night in June. The rocks were dangerous, even in calm weather. It wasn't a place families went casually, and Peter's friend later told police she wasn't someone who enjoyed that kind of outing. The physical evidence didn't support him. Detectives noted that the toilet block sat uphill from the car park, with a visible line of sight between the two locations. Anyone walking there would leave a trace. Peter didn't. His effect raised eyebrows. This was noted quietly, not publicly, but investigators expected to see shock, panic, frantic behaviour, the hallmarks of someone who had just witnessed a sudden disappearance. Instead, Richard's presentation was inconsistent. Emotional at moments, flat at others, oddly composed in ways that didn't match the urgency of his account. And then there was Peter's car, found locked in the car park with her keys inside. Not dropped, not lost, neatly placed. It didn't look like the belongings of someone who had just walked into the wind and disappeared. By late morning, police were already treating the situation as suspicious. And when they made the journey to inform Peter's family, they found confusion, fear, and disbelief. Her mother was devastated. Her extended family were stunned. Her cousin Simone, one of the people Peter confided in most, was adamant. Peter would not walk away. She would not leave the children she fought so hard to raise. She would not vanish voluntarily. She would not harm herself. She would not go fishing in the dark. Simone described Peter as someone who lived in fear but also in purpose. Someone who endured for her children. Someone who had been fighting to build a safer life. Nothing about Richard's story aligned with Peter, not the Peter she knew. Her family began contacting one another, passing the news through whispered, trembling phone calls. They repeated the same sentences over and over. She wouldn't do that. She'd never leave Abigail. She would have called. This doesn't make sense. And still no trace of Peter. As officers continued to interview Richard over the next 48 hours, they noted further inconsistencies. His description of Peter's clothing changed. His movements shifted. He struggled to explain why they chose such a dangerous, lonely location on a winter night. Investigators also quietly noted something else. In the hours following her disappearance, Richard did not behave like a man desperate for answers. He wasn't calling family, he wasn't urging a wider search, he wasn't scattering frantic questions. His behaviour was steady, controlled, the opposite of what detectives expected to see. Within days, police began looking beyond the cliffs. Because while the gap gave them no evidence of Peter's presence, Richard's history gave them another direction entirely. A pattern was beginning to emerge, one that would only grow clearer as officers spoke to the people who knew Peter best. The people who had seen her in the months before she vanished. The people who had heard her whisper fears she couldn't say aloud too often. A pattern of anger, a pattern of control, a pattern of threats, a pattern of a woman trying to leave. The kind of pattern investigators recognized immediately, even before the terminology existed. The kind that often precedes the worst possible outcomes. In the days after Peter's disappearance, detectives pushed deeper into her life, not because they were looking for scandal, but because the scene at the gap had given them nothing. If the cliffs weren't the answer, then the truth was somewhere else, somewhere closer, somewhere quieter. What they found were people who had been waiting, silently, for someone to finally ask the right questions. Her cousin Simone, she had told investigators that Peter had confided in her, sometimes quietly, sometimes through tears. Peter said Richard was controlling. She said he shouted at her, that he limited her choices around money, that he punished her for small decisions he didn't approve of. She said she felt trapped. She said she was frightened. The coronial findings accepted Simone's evidence in full. Then was her mother. She described the same patterns: anxiety, fear, withdrawal. Peter would arrive at her home distressed. She would seek refuge, then go back because she felt she had no other option. Her mother told the inquest that Peter had said she wanted to leave Richard, not impulsively, but deliberately. She was planning toward it. Her friends. They recalled Peter describing arguments, jealousy, threats, financial control. The feeling that she could not do anything without Richard watching, questioning, or interrogating her afterwards. She spoke about the way he treated John and how it frightened her. The coroner accepted all of this as credible and consistent. Bit by bit, a pattern emerged, not a single dramatic moment, but a long accumulation of behaviours that pointed towards coercive control and escalating risk. Even without the modern terminology, investigators recognised these signs. And then there were the allegations that cut through every interview like wire. The locking her in rooms. Multiple people came forward saying Peter had told them that Richard had locked her in a room during conflict. Keeping someone contained, limiting their ability to leave, is now understood as a red flag for dangerous escalation. The bruises. Family members recalled seeing marks she tried to hide. Statements described her brushing them off, typical of someone trying to minimize harm, not wanting to provoke further conflict, or not feeling safe enough to tell the truth. The custody threat. Perhaps the most powerful form of control Richard had was Abigail. Peter adored both of her children, but Abigail was the youngest, the most vulnerable, and the one Richard insisted would remain with him if Peter tried to leave again. This trapped her in Albany. It trapped her in that house. It trapped her in proximity to a man she feared. The coronial findings described these factors as risk indicators, and the coroner emphasised that these controls formed the backdrop to Peter's final months. But the piece that stood out to investigators and later to the coroner came not from years before Peter vanished, but from the years after. The later partner. When Richard entered a new relationship after Peter's disappearance, that woman later told police that he'd once made a chilling comment, that it was easy to commit the perfect crime. She believed he was referring to Peter. The coronial findings included this in evidence. It was not dismissed. It was not considered irrelevant. It was another piece in a growing mosaic. It showed he was capable of making such a statement. It showed he was thinking in those terms, and it showed how he spoke when Peter wasn't there to hear him. Investigators noted all of this. They knew the risk factors, they knew the timelines, they knew Peter was planning to leave, which is the most dangerous moment in any abusive relationship. And they knew that Richard's account of the gap did not match the physical evidence. But the case was stalled. There was no body, there was no confession, no witness, and within 3 years, the person they believe held the truth, the only person who could tell them what happened in the hours before dawn, was gone. Richard's death. He died by a self-inflicted gunshot wound in June of 2000. He left no note, no explanation, no mention of Peter, no confession. For detectives, it felt like the final closing of a door that had been pushed against for years. But the case was not over. It simply became silent again. It would take more than 2 decades and a renewed cold case investigation before the silence would begin to break. For years after Peter Webber disappeared, the case sat in a kind of strange limbo. It was open but not active, suspicious but without enough evidence for charges. Everyone who loved her believed something terrible had happened, but belief is not proof. And Albany carried the story like a bruise, visible to those who touched it, ignored by those who didn't. But detectives never forgot Peter. And eventually the file returned to the desks of investigators who specialised in cases that never went away. The officers who inherited Peter's case were not the same ones who stood at the gap in 1997, staring down that unforgiving water. They had distance, perspective, decades of collective experience, and modern frameworks for understanding domestic abuse that didn't exist when Peter vanished. They opened every single document, every single statement, every report, and every inconsistency. And the picture that formed was sharper than ever. The timeline was impossible. So Richard's account of the night before Peter vanished had too many gaps, too many estimated times, too many unexplained movements, and no corroboration. They noted that the early detectives had observed nothing placed Peter at the gap except Richard's words. The scene contradicted him. Modern forensic reasoning reinforced what officers had seen in 1997. If Peter had walked to the toilets, there would have been evidence. There wasn't any. If she had fallen, the sea would have given up something, and it didn't. The relationship context was now clearly understood as coercive control. The statements from Simone, from Peter's mother, from friends, these were no longer treated as relationship issues. There were clear indicators of risk, evidence of isolation, intimidation, financial control, monitoring, threats, fear, and a woman planning to leave. What Peter described in 1997 didn't yet have a name, and now it did. The perfect crime allegation mattered. So investigators weighed the later partner's statement with caution, but they didn't dismiss it. Combined with every other factor, it spoke to mindset. It spoke to capability, and it spoke to confidence. Richard's death complicated everything, but also clarified some things. When a suspect dies, investigators lose the opportunity for interrogation or for a confession, but they also lose the possibility of retaliation, intimidation, manipulation, or future danger to witnesses. Cold case detectives spoke to people who had never felt safe enough to speak in the early years. They described things they'd seen, things they'd heard, things Peter had told them. Their accounts weren't dramatic. They weren't sensational, but they were consistent, and consistency is power. The anonymous call remained unexplained. The cold case team revisited it. They knew it could be a hoax, but the timing was hard to ignore. The specificity was hard to ignore. The fact that the caller implicated Richard moments into the search was hard to ignore. It didn't solve the case, but it did strengthen the pattern. As detectives pulled the pieces together, their central conclusion began to match what Peter's family had believed since the day she vanished. Peter did not die because she walked away. She did not die because she slipped. She did not die because she fell. A violent event occurred, likely inside the time frame of Saturday night into early Sunday, before the 7:32 a.m. call to police was ever made. This conclusion was not speculation. It was the only explanation consistent with the evidence. The cold case review confirmed it, and their findings became the foundation of what came next in the 2023 coronial inquest. For the first time in 26 years, Peter's story would be laid out in full, examined with modern understanding, supported by decades of investigative work, and presented before the coroner with the power to speak openly about what the evidence truly showed. It was the moment her family had waited decades for, not for closure, because closure is a myth, but for truth, for confirmation, for the acknowledgement that they had carried in their bones since the moment Peter failed to come home. By the time the inquest into the suspected death of Peter Simone Weber opened in 2023, 26 years had passed since she was last seen. For her family, the wait had been a lifetime. For her children, now adults, the inquest was the first time they could hear an official public examination of what had happened to their mother. And for coroner Sarah Linton, the task was clear: to assess the evidence, old and new, and determine what could be said formally, finally, about how Peter died. The hearings were held at the Albany courthouse. The atmosphere, those present recalled, was heavy. Decades of silence and speculation were about to be laid bare, witness by witness. Peter's mother and relatives gave evidence about her life, her relationships, and the fear she lived with in the months leading up to her disappearance. They described Richard as controlling, jealous, and unpredictable. They spoke of arguments, bruises, and of Peter turning up distressed at their homes. The coroner accepted their testimony as credible. Simone, her cousin, described Peter arriving at her house in tears, saying she didn't feel safe at home. She spoke of Peter wanting to leave Richard, of her fear of what he might do, and of the way he used Abigail to keep her from walking away. Simone also described the bruises she had seen and the threats Peter had confided. Her evidence was accepted in full. Several friends told the inquest that Peter had expressed fear of Richard. They described her as becoming more withdrawn. They said she talked about trying to leave again. They saw control, manipulation, and hostility within her marriage. Their accounts were consistent and accepted. One woman who was in a relationship with Richard after Peter's disappearance told the inquest that he had once said it was easy to commit the perfect crime. She believed he was referring to Peter, and the coroner included this evidence and noted its relevance to Richard's mindset and behaviour. Detectives from the original investigation, along with members of the cold case homicide squad, presented a unified, detailed account of their findings. They described the absence of any evidence at the gap, the inconsistencies in Richard's accounts, the lack of independent sightings of Peter on the night she vanished, the complete silence from the sea, no debris, no remains, the early suspicion raised by the anonymous call. Their assessment was clear. The evidence strongly suggested Peter never went to the gap at all. The coroner summarised the physical evidence with striking clarity. No footprints leading to the toilets, no disturbed vegetation, no trace of her belongings, no indicators of a fall, no environmental evidence that she had been anywhere near the cliff's edge. This directly contradicted Richard's story. The coroner stated that his account was not supported by the physical evidence. She also noted that Richard's story appeared to be an explanation constructed to fit a scenario that had not occurred. The coroner placed significant weight on the evidence of domestic violence. She outlined what the testimony showed: jealousy, intimidation, punishment, financial control, isolation, manipulation, increasing hostility, Peter's growing fear, and her preparations to leave. The coroner highlighted that these behaviours are known as predictors of lethal violence, especially around the time a woman attempts to leave a controlling partner. The inquest acknowledged Peter's vulnerability in these final months and identified her situation as one of significant risk. After hearing all of the evidence, the coroner made several decisive conclusions. Peter is deceased. She died on or about June 22nd, 1997. She did not die by accident. There was a considerable body of evidence that she met with foul play. She did not willingly walk away. There was no evidence to suggest she would abandon her children, her belongings, or her life. Richard's account was false. The coroner formally rejected his version of events as inconsistent with the physical evidence and unsupported by any independent information. The evidence strongly supported Richard's involvement. While she could not make a formal finding of homicide because Richard was deceased and the standard of proof in a coronial inquest differs from a criminal trial, the coroner's language was unambiguous. Her conclusions aligned with the police view. Peter likely died as a result of violence inflicted by someone she knew, and her body was intentionally concealed. Richard Webber died 3 years after Peter disappeared. He never confessed. He never provided a coherent explanation. He never clarified what happened in those hours. His death closed the door on prosecution, but it did not close the door on truth. The inquest did that. Finally, publicly, and for the record. When the coroner laid out her findings in 2023, the legal language was careful, restrained, and measured, as it must be. But beneath every conclusion sat something bigger than a single case, a pattern that extends far beyond one woman, one marriage, one June weekend in Albany. Peter's story, her fear, her silence, her attempts to leave, her hope, her caution, is a story that repeats itself across Australia every single day. Women don't wake up one morning in dangerous relationships. They arrive there slowly, by erosion, by exhaustion, by adapting to small changes that at first don't seem dangerous at all. Jealousy becomes monitoring, monitoring becomes rules, rules become punishments, punishments become fear, and fear becomes normal. The coronial evidence in Peter's case read like a checklist of the risk indicators that domestic violence workers know too well now. Isolation, financial control, threats, unpredictability, children used as leverage, a woman planning to leave, the most dangerous moment of all. These patterns aren't dramatic, they aren't cinematic, they don't look like stories people imagine when they hear the word violence. They are subtle, quiet, insidious, and they sit beneath the surface of thousands of relationships across this country. When the coroner spoke about Peter's fear, she wasn't speculating. She was recognising something that experts now identify as one of the most significant predictors of lethal harm. And the numbers reflect that danger. Across Australia, 1 woman a week is killed by her current or former partner. Some years it is more. In Western Australia, domestic violence is one of the leading causes of homicide. Since the pandemic began, the rates of coercive control, intimate partner violence, and domestic homicides have risen sharply. None of this is abstract in Peter's story. It was the context of her life. It shaped the choices she could make. It shaped the moments she stayed. It shaped the dangers she was living with. And ultimately, it shaped the risk that followed her into that final weekend. When you read the coronial report closely, you can see the warnings everywhere. But warnings only matter when someone is safe enough to act on them. Peter wasn't. She didn't have the financial freedom or custody rights or support systems that we have now. She didn't have the language to describe what she was living through. She didn't have the safety that leaving requires. What she had was a complicated love for her children, a fear of losing them, and a hope that she could find a path forward. She did everything she could with what she had, and she deserved more. Her story isn't just a crime, it's a reflection of what happens when systems fail to see danger until it's too late, and how even decades later, the truth still matters. Because when a woman like Peter disappears, she doesn't just vanish from a place. She vanishes from a family, a community, a future she never got to live. And she becomes a reminder, whispered through courtrooms and coronial files and the memories of those who loved her, of how important it is to listen to fear, to recognise patterns, to take seriously the quiet warnings that so often precede the worst. Peter's life was full of moments where someone should have been able to say, "This isn't safe, this isn't normal, this is escalating, this needs intervention." Those moments weren't acted on, and that silence became part of the story. In the quiet that followed the inquest, one truth lingered more clearly than anything else. Peter's life did not end because she walked away from it. It ended because someone made the decision that she wouldn't have had a future beyond that winter night. Her absence became a wound that never closed. Her children grew up without the mother who adored them. Her family learned to live with the ache of not knowing where she is. And Albany, a place defined by wind, cliffs, and ocean, holds a silence that should never have existed. The coroner's findings did not give back what was taken, but they restored what had been doubted for too long. Peter was loved, she was trying, she was frightened, she deserved protection. And what happened to her was not an accident, not misadventure, not disappearance by choice. It was violence, concealment, the deliberate removal of a young mother from the world. She cannot fade. Her story must be told. And the silence around her life, the silence at the gap, must never be mistaken for peace. Peter deserved a full life. She deserved safety. She deserved to watch her children grow. And she deserved more than questions. If you have any information about the disappearance of Peter Simone Weber, please contact Crime Stoppers on 1-800 333 000 or make a report on www.crimestopperswa.com.au. You can remain anonymous. And if you recognise any of these signs we talked about in today's episodes and need help or know someone who does need help, please call the Domestic Violence Support Line on 1-800 737 732. Until next time, stay kind, stay curious, and never forget those who vanished from the West.